And I want to talk with you about leadership, but primarily, we've talked about professional development versus professional learning, and really what that means in context for people in education. But let's tie that to principal leadership.
Okay.
I know you've done you've had a lot of conversations around that and sharing expertise. Tell me about where we are with principal leadership and where we should be going with all the developments here in education, when we often don't talk so much about the leadership and principalship, but we should.
Right. I think we're actually in a good place in the education industry around principal leadership and the principal leadership development that leaders need, because it's being talked about and paid attention to. So that's a good thing. And I think it's always been there. It's just that just like teachers, and the professional learning they need, it's becoming much more important to recognize what principals need for their professional learning and leadership development, so that they are the best instructional leaders that they can be. And instructional leadership is such a buzzword. Everyone talks about, well, we need principals who are instructional leaders. But I think at ASCD, one of the things we really concentrate on, and have always concentrated on, is what instructional leadership really means, and all that it entails for principals to be highly effective in that area.
So what does that mean to you then? I mean, help sort of whittle that down for us.
Well, I think the ASCD Principal Leadership Development Framework kind of describes it really well. And what we do is look at 4 areas for principals as instructional leaders. So one is the principal as visionary. And what does it mean for a principal to really have that strong vision of curriculum, assessment, instruction, how that impacts what happens in their school and school community, and what that means for student learning. So what is that vision? How do they get buy-in and keep it alive? How do they make decisions around everything that they're doing with that vision in mind? So that's a big piece of it. Second is the principal as instructional leader. And what does it really mean to be a leader of curriculum, assessment, and instruction in your building? What's your role? What are the things that you should be moving forward with your staff, in your school community, to make sure that instruction really takes the place and the focus that it needs to have, in a school for school improvement to happen. And that's at every school, whether your school is a struggling school, whether you're considered average, whether you're considered high performing, whatever you're considered, those are areas that principals really need to be strong in.
Tell me about the community of principals. I mean, we look at other industries, we see if there's a CEO, we see sort of the loneliness that comes with being, the one that is supposed to know everything,
right,
have the vision. How are principals in creating communities of like-minded and sort of similar positions, so that they have that camaraderie, they have that support, they have a learning, we talk about learning communities with teachers.
Right.
Do we have that with principals?
I think that it's more and more becoming the practice.
Okay.
I think that a lot of times districts don't have the structures in place to allow that community of practice, that community of learning for principals. And so it's oftentimes up to principals to create those learning communities themselves. Another aspect of the ASCD Principal Leadership Development Framework is the principal as a learner and collaborator, which is really what you just talked about. How do we make sure we have a community of practice amongst ourselves as principals? How do we make sure we're talking about problems of practice in our buildings, so that we're working with, like-minded individuals, whether that's within our own school community or further, a wider group of principals who are dealing with the same problems of practice? How do we come together in different ways because, just like teachers, and I think even more so than teachers, having principals have to see each other or do face-to-face, leadership meetings or community of practice meetings where they're really talking about best practice and how they can move their schools forward. It's not as realistic as it used to be. There's not time for that to happen so much on a consistent basis. I need to have my community of practice and feedback and input from them more than once a month at a principal's meeting that the district may have.
That's not going to suffice.
Right, that's not going to suffice. So I need to make sure that I have this community, this learning community, this community of practice. And a lot of times it ends up being virtual, that we are communicating and collaborating in virtual ways, but we're focused. I know, in several districts that I know of, they're implementing those online communities of practice. And then they do things like, the principals from feeder pattern schools will get together once a month for a breakfast meeting, or, for a dinner meeting. It doesn't have anything to do with what the district is requiring. It's part of my own community of practice and the professional learning and leadership development I know I need to move myself forward as an instructional leader, and therefore to move my school forward.
Let's talk about the talent pool of principals. Are we doing a good job of identifying sort of that next group that should be able to come in and be successful as a school leader? And have those variables changed over time? Are we looking for different talents and skills?
I think we are looking for different talents and skills, maybe even different talents and skills that may have been looked for, 5 or 6 years ago. I think that the focus on technology, how technology is used in instruction and in schools, the focus on accountability in a very different way. How teachers are being held to higher levels and different types of accountability, how principals are being held to different types of accountability. I think it does require some different things, but I also think that the talent needed to be a good principal is something that should be a commitment of every district. That they should, districts have to invest in really strong leadership development to help to have that pool of talent and that pool of aspiring principals ready to go, so that you're not having principals that are falling into the job or that are, becoming a principal because they were an assistant principal. They've actually been nurtured and have taken part in the right type of leadership development, so that the leadership succession plan that a district may have in place for principals is really strong.
Because there's a real impact. I had a conversation with now a former principal who was very tech-oriented, and staff really enjoyed that, and especially the kids. Well, then they were telling me, not even 90 days later, that the individual that took over, I don't know if they fell into your example, was not exactly from that same frame. And this former principal was hearing conversations from even students saying, we missed that environment. And it speaks to that succession planning. Are we doing a good job of setting up sort of that next group? So leads me to my question, is there a sweet spot with the amount of time someone should be a principal? Meaning, does it still work to be in a principalship for 20 years, 10 years? I mean, is there sort of a time frame that we should be looking at?
You mean as far as them
not term limits, but staying in a principalship, sure.
No, because I think it depends on the person. Just like in every profession, I wouldn't say, okay, you're a doctor and you can only be a doctor for 10 years. I mean, of course not. What you are is a principal who is committed to continuous learning and ongoing improvement. Once again, the principal as learner and collaborator. That's why that's so important. So it's not about how long you're in the principalship, it's how you develop.
So it's really
as
about,
you're
you're
in
not
the
like checks
principal.
and balances so that they're continuing to learn themselves and
Right.
stay up on.
Exactly. I
Yeah.
mean, it's just like any other profession. You know, you wouldn't want a doctor to operate on you who's bringing in techniques from 20 years ago and they've never improved their craft. So it's,
That'd be a little scary, right?
It's
Yeah.
the same thing with,
Yeah.
with principals, of course. You know, you want people to be continuous learners, to be focused on continual improvement, to be focused on reflection and growth as a learner and as a professional and as a principal who leads a school. So I know principals that, you know, have been in the same principalship or have been a principal and maybe in different schools for over 20 years. And they're just as dynamic and just as much of an instructional leader, even more so maybe than they were 20 years ago, because they've learned more, they've applied their learning, they've kept themselves up to date in instructional practices, leadership practices, what really makes a difference with student learning. And, you know, they're open to that. So just because I've been in my career for 20 years, it doesn't mean that I can't be the best instructional leader who is really good with technology and gets, you know, all of the pros and cons of having a, you know, a technology-based school or technology-based instruction, and is able to help their teachers with that.
And let's close with this. I would imagine that you, when you're traveling around and you meet educators, I would bet that there is an alarm bell that goes off in your own mind when you meet somebody because of the way they talk about learning, the way they talk about their own practice, that, and you might say to yourself, they have what it takes to be a really great principal. One, am I right? And two, what is it that typically jumps off for you when you hear somebody, you see them speak, or you get to know them, that you say, they may not have thought about this as a professional path, but my goodness, they seem to really have some of the foundational components to be an excellent principal?
I would say this. First of all, it doesn't necessarily jump out at me, because there's so many paths that you can take now in education where you can have that leadership impact, and you don't have to be a principal. You could be a teacher leader who remains in the classroom but still has the, you know, strong impact on their colleagues, on the profession, on their students. So it doesn't necessarily jump out at me like maybe it used to, because there's different,
More avenues.
so many different paths you can take now that maybe weren't as recognized in the past. But you know, I also think that highly effective principals, you know, have some skills and talents and understandings that you recognize when they speak. You know, when they talk about learning, when they talk about students, when they talk about their mindset. You know, you can tell that mindset they have around expectations for their students, expectations for teachers. So not having any limitations on how they think about student learning or teacher learning is a huge, to me, sign that, hey, this person would really be great leading a school. You know, because a lot of it is about your mindset as a professional and your belief system, you know, as far as students and teachers and parents and families and what everybody's bringing to the table that can contribute to ongoing learning in a school.
I'm glad you put it that way, because in a world where sadly we've had a number of tragedies, obviously around the world, in school environments, it does potentially change the type of leadership we might need in a building to be able to communicate to so many different people during challenging times.
And I think, you know, even really during any time, but especially now in our society, because we are so diverse. You know, we're not, you know, we're just a very diverse society now. And a leader has to be aware of the strengths of diversity and how to capitalize on that within their families and communities and businesses and other folks they work with, as well as within their school community, you know, their teachers, their other staff members, and their students. So I think that's a huge change in, in leadership, and one of the qualities you just really have to be able to make the best of everything. And I agree, being aware of, you know, some of the challenges in our society right now, and challenges that families have, as they're bringing their kids up that we didn't even have 5 years ago. I mean, things that kids are aware of, and how to capitalize on those strengths, and not look at things always as deficits and challenges.
Well, thank you for highlighting some of the really great things that are going on with the population, sometimes marginalized, but should never be, because they provide such an integral part to successful education environments. Thank you.
Thank you.